She was the one who could lift a fallen antler with 2 fingers and still laugh at the ache afterwards. The firelight pulled the planes of her face into sharp, living maps. Cheekbones, the line of a jaw that had learned to set traps and loosen knots, the faint scar that ran like a river over the inside of her wrist from a childhood tumble. Tonight the scar had a new meaning. She coughed, and the sound startled the band into a hush. The cough was not the rough, useful cough of smoke and exertion. It came soft, then jagged, like a reed snapping in a sudden wind, and it left her breath shallow, as if the world had grown a little heavier. Around the low circle of stones, the tribe moved in close choreography. Hands smoothed skin and hair. A younger woman pressed warm moss to the hollow under the collarbone. A man with long arms traced the throat, listening for the rasp that had started hours before. Small rituals of care governed their movements. No prayers offered to named gods, no formal liturgy, only the precise, practical gestures that had kept them alive long enough to grow old. Warm water from the stream, steam over crushed root, the soft, repetitive hum the elder made while re-knitting a sleeve or braiding a child's hair. These gestures weren't panacea, they were familiarity made into a net. Outside the circle, beyond the lamplight of their single, carefully tended fire, the night was a wide, indifferent ocean, a sweep of grass and pale star, a breath of wind that smelled of river and the faint decay of last summer's leaves. The sound of distant hooves and the crack of small lives going about their business twinned with the tiny, acute noises inside the band. To survive in this place, you had to be able to recognize the small differences, the fraction of delay in a breath, the way a hand trembled when it reached for water, and treat them as loud as thunder. The fever came like a small, steady tide that rose inside the chest, heat behind the eyes, a shiver that did not respect the nearest warmth. The woman who had tied rope and watched over children began to drift between animal and human thought, making sounds that were not names, but fetches of memory, images of the river that had once taken her brother downstream, and of the bright fruit-bearing shrub by the rock. The tribe understood these half-sentences. They were the band's language of loss. They also understood that some illnesses promised only one ending, and so the motion of the circle tightened with the mechanical, grim efficiency of people who had had to make choices for the sake of a many-bodied future. This is a speculative question, a thought experiment. Imagine for a moment the small scene we have sketched, simple hands tending a body at the edge of known things, and then imagine a possibility the tribe had no word for. What if a presence arrived that did not belong to the myths they could name, bridging what they felt with a knowledge they could not yet hold?
What if a saving, not of gods, but of something stranger, took place in that small, fragile hour? Consider this a story told in the key of wonder, rather than a claim about the past. If you like speculative histories that sit between science and myth and want to explore the ethical questions these scenarios raise, stay with this story, subscribe, and you'll find more like it. They tried everything they knew. In the shallow shelter made of bent saplings and hides, someone ground bitter leaves into pulp, warmed them over the coals, and pressed them against the woman's ribs. Someone else tore a strip of woven fiber and tied it above her brow, an improvised bandage to catch the sweat and to hold her in the present. A child, not yet used to the habits of the adult world, slipped his small cheek against the patient's fingers and breathed as if to warm them from the inside. All of this was not only about fixing lungs or stopping fever. Each gesture stitched the social fabric. Touch says, "I remain." Care says, "You are not alone." That was the practical theology of the band. Touch, presence, the redistribution of risk. But the disease did not understand gestures. The cough turned ragged. At one point she vomited into the ash, her small body convulsing as if someone was pulling at the threads that tied muscle to will. The smell that rose, salt and bile, and the scorched sharpness of herbs, hung over them like a testament. On the third night, others began to show signs. A hunter who had gone out at dawn returned with red-rimmed eyes by dusk, his skin hot beneath his fur. The healer, such as she was, spread her hands and tried a different preparation, a decoction of bitter bark and the smoked resin from a pine cone that had once amused a child with its sparks. There were instructions without language. Do not crowd, do keep the sick warm, and when a fever runs high, let the sufferer have their space to breathe without the weight of hands. But the disease ignored custom. When fear mounts, the motions of a society unravel in predictable ways. Some pressed for extremes. Let the sick be left to the wolves, they said, their faces drawn into the geometry of survival. Others insisted, we cannot abandon our kin. To do so is to invite a pattern that will swallow the whole. Words were short and hard. The head of the band, older, cautious, with a scar of his own like a moonmark on the temple, moved between the two like a tide between rocks, weighing immediate survival against the costs of ostracism. He had been present at too many endings to court sentimentality. His face, usually a quiet harbor, now displayed a thin map of sleepless decisions. For a moment, no one could tell whether the band's future meant remaining together and risking extinction, or splitting apart to preserve some threads of life at the expense of others.
These were not philosophical abstractions. They were choices made in the raw arithmetic of breath. Who should go and who should stay? How to alter the risk of contagion when you lack understanding of the mechanism. The protagonist, call her Cora, a name offered for our comfort, though the band would not have named things with the same cadence we use, slid into that liminal space between decision and consequence. She had a particular way of speaking with children, a soft click that meant wait, and a laugh that translated care into action. Tonight, her laugh came thinner. Her hands, usually deft and sure, trembled as she accepted water. Her eyes opened and closed as if trying to hold a world that was slipping. Illness brought a peculiar honesty. It removed the ornament of plans and left the bare human geometry, to breathe, to be held, to know that someone else was near. The band's small rituals that night read like a liturgy of preservation. A shared cup passed and filtered through fingers to avoid contamination. The placement of a flat stone under a cheek to keep the neck stable. A slow, consonant chant the elder hummed while scraping at wood. They did not know they were making memory, but they were. In the space between coughs, Cora remembered a river that had been a mirror when she was little. A silver thing she could walk along and see endless small selves, each a wave. The memory rose with fever. She could almost feel multiplicity, an echo, herself as water, rock, breath. It was not a doctrine, it was a sensory ghost, a fleeting synesthesia in which the sound of river water folded into the pattern of her own heartbeat. The thought comforted her, and when the thought slipped away, she clung to the after-image like a rope. As sunrise came, bringing a grayness that softened the night's sharp edges, the disease seemed to quicken. No longer were small treatments enough. Where once the fever would ebb and give a moment's breath, now it pressed like a weight over the thorax. People who had been careful to keep distance now broke that rule and crowded close again, because the tether of being was stronger than the arithmetic of fear. Eyes met in the dim crosslight. Some held accusation, others held mourning. Many simply held exhaustion. The band's predictability, its habitual reliance on mutual aid, was both its salvation and its complication. A sick member made the whole group vulnerable, and the necessity of close care cut away at the strategies of precaution. In one quiet, terrible hour, the head proposed the oldest possible compromise: confine the sick under the lee of the rocks and ration visits. No one wanted it, but the head's face made it clear that refusal was a gamble on a dice no one wished to roll. There were arguments, though no one screamed. The young hunter argued with the healer. The children cried in the corners. Older women folded cloth with hands that tried to translate fear into order. Someone suggested an old custom: walk the sick to the far edge of the camp where the wind would take contagion away. Another said that such customs were for simpler plagues, not for this, which came with such speed. The band's social fabric strained along lines that had always been present: the slow accumulation of debts and favors, the tiny hierarchies of who collected mushrooms and who could stitch a heel, even the small injustices that had been tolerated because life was hard and choices were fewer. Cora lay inside an animal hide shelter, the edge of it flapping like a small wing in the breeze. When she could, she reached for the hand of the young woman who had tended her. The touch was immediate and grounding. The woman pressed her forehead to Cora's, as if to exchange something that words could not carry: warmth, steadiness, the fragile fact of another consciousness. For a moment Cora's mind cleared, and she watched the breathing of the other as if it were a small, separate star. Her thoughts coursed with quiet animal metaphors:
the way a wave keeps shape even while dissolving, the way a seed holds inside it the exact map of a tree. These were the images that filled the nighttime, images without names that nonetheless felt like the only fitting language for what she experienced. On the fourth day, the band awoke to a new pressure in the air, an animal sense that something else had shifted. The world felt as if someone had tightened a string somewhere very far away, and the reverberation had reached them in a skin wave. It was the sort of perception you notice only if you are used to the world's whisperings, a slight tilt of the light, an absence of some distant habitual sound. A child pointed to the sky, the small voice cutting through the hum of worry. High above the band, over the line of hills and the scatter of trees, there was a sense of light that did not belong, a small, steadied glow that hovered without the urgings of known fire. They had seen unidentified phenomena before, meteors and the slow, accidental glare of sun on river, but this was different. It hung, patient and impossible, like a moth that refused to be chased away. For the hunter who had returned sick, for the elder whose hands had kept the band from fracturing, and for Cora, who tasted river within her chest, the bright thing in the sky registered as both threat and promise. Threat because the unknown invariably carried risk. Promise because the unknown also meant possibility. The band hushed as one animal might when a predator's scent shifts on the wind. The head went out, eyes narrowing as he shaded them with a forearm. He had a spear, but the gesture of going outside with a spear was more ritual than aggression. It was a way of showing resolve, of letting the small one see that he had not fled the world's edges. He squinted downward and then lifted his hand, pointing at the bright dot. No one had words to name it.
Instead, they used the language that remained, hand signs, a small chorus of hissed syllables, the breath that comes when a group draws in a collective intake. From each shelter, people streamed out in pairs, curious and cautious. The sick remained wrapped, for the fear of contagion had not yet ebbed from anyone's mind. Cora felt her skin prickling as if the glow above pierced even the barrier of hides. The light was not the thin silver of the moon or the scattered brightness of distant stars. It was internal to itself, soft like bioluminescent algae, but steady and organized, the way a hand arranges pebbles. As it came closer, shapes emerged. No hard geometry of metal or spikes, but an orb of light that shifted like a living thing. There was no sound from it. Silence seemed to swell and reconfigure around the band, compressing the usual rustle of night into a single attentive hush. The orb lowered with deliberate slowness, the kind taught by patience rather than speed. It settled at the far edge of the open, hovering no more than a spear's throw away, bathing the grass in pale, wet light. Panic was not the first reaction. Instead, there was a kind of sacred confusion. The band's first collective movement was not to flee but to observe. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was curiosity. The children pressed forward, audacious in their smallness, while the elders retreated a pace, opting to hold the space and let the young absorb. The orb tilted, if an orb could tilt, and from its surface a fine filament of light extended like the bankrupt thread of a spider, then retracted. The air tasted different, clearer, sharper, and somehow cooler at the margins. Cora felt an almost medicinal quality to it, a sensation like the coolness of a stream running over bruised skin. When the orb's filament unraveled and touched the ground near Cora's shelter, the grass did not scorch. Instead, it quivered as if woken. A hush swept through the band. The elder who had hummed while scraping wood stepped forward with a primitive caution, hands raised, palms visible. The filament's touch did not make a noise, but a series of impressions flooded Cora's inner senses, images, not translated into words, that felt like a flood of remembered things. There was the image of countless threads braided into a fabric, each thread trembling under the same hand. There was the feeling of a large, slow heartbeat that was not hers, but with which her own pulse could resonate. And then, so brief she could have mistaken it for fever delirium, the sense of being both inside a single breath and simultaneously the breath itself sweeping across plains and seas. It was not a sermon. It was a taste, a tangent that linked her smallness to a possibility that made language clumsy. Cora's breath stilled under the filament's approach. The filament's light shivered once, like an insect skipping across water, and the impression stopped.
The band exhaled as one, an enormous human release of tension that left small blank spaces in their faces. No voice spoke. The orb hovered, patient as a guardian at a threshold, and a kind of compulsion to watch took hold. The hunter who had been ill leaned on his spear, the sick among them rapt but alert. Even the ones who had advocated abandonment watched with mouths slightly parted. Then the filament pulled back, and for a heartbeat Cora expected nothing to change, but outcomes do not always follow expectation. Small things did shift, almost imperceptibly, as if a hidden lever had been turned. The young woman who had pressed her forehead to Cora's now hummed a note that was not her usual pattern. It contained a cadence that steadied, like the metronome of a song. A child who had been skittish now moved closer to the sick, bringing a bowl of cooled broth without being told. The hunter who had insisted on distance lowered his head and wrapped a fur more carefully around the fevered king of their group. These were small gestures. They were also signs of an economy of care recalibrating itself. Not every look at the orb was one of awe. Some faces hardened with suspicion. A few whispered of trickery, of spirits who might steal breath, of mischief. The band's habitual caution reasserted itself in murmured lore. Strangers can mean harm. The head raised his hand again, the spear a reminder that hospitality has costs. The orb did nothing in response. It did not shout. It did not demand offerings or worship. Its presence was a fact, and facts can be uncomfortable in their neutrality. As the morning warmed, the orb drew closer still, easing into the clearing like a tide pulling in. It did not land in violence. Instead, it alit with a softness that let the band inside the moment. From its center, a presence seemed to unspool, not a human shape, but something more like a suggestion of a body. Filaments of light arranged with a composure that betrayed deliberation. Bioluminescent filaments drifted like hair in an underwater current. The presence was not anthropomorphic. It had no eyes to roll in their sockets, no mouth to form vowels. Yet the band felt seen, and there was, in that perception, neither threat nor egotistical superiority. When the filament brushed the air near Cora again, the impression that came this time was slower, as if choosing its images with care. There was an internal feeling of being part of a woven thing, and then, like a pebble causing concentric ripples, an image came of a single drop in an endless ocean, a tiny bright note that both is and is not separated from the whole. The filament seemed to linger on that image, offering it like an opiate or a salve. Cora tried to speak, to string together syllables that would ask what this was, but the words failed.
Instead, her memory reached for more primitive signifiers, the scent of wet earth after rain, the friction of another's skin against hers, the way a mother's breath can shape a child's sleep. The filament's light gave the sense that some other intelligence was translating not through speech, but through direct experiential overlay, sewing a small patch of context into Cora's felt world. Around them, the band's dynamics shifted like tectonic plates under slow stress. Some saw the orb as a savior before any act of saving had occurred. Anticipation swelled into a kind of tentative worship among a few. Others saw it as danger incarnate, an unknown to be fought or shunned. The head, who had long been the human calculator of danger and safety, did not offer a verdict. Instead, he did what humans have always done in the face of mystery. He held. He allowed the band to choose with their bodies and not just names. Cora felt the alien presence, not as a voice over the air, but as an inner pulse that matched the beat of her heart and then slid a fraction out of sync to show her the existence of something larger. It was not explanation, it was a suggestion. Remember this, it seemed to say, as if memory itself were a duty. At the edge of that prompt, something else happened. The sick hunter's breathing adjusted. A catch that had lodged in the throat seemed to find release. It was minimal, no vivid cure, and yet it registered as a practical shift. The healer ran to the man's side, feeling for pulse, for modulation. The numbers of the body are small things, a heartbeat that steadies by a few increments, a temperature that drops a degree. The healer's face, usually set in the neutral light of routine, softened with an astonished hope. Hope is a dangerous thing in a community bound by reality. It invites both possibility and disappointment. For the first time in days, the band allowed itself a small, fragile optimism. But underlying that optimism was a chord of suspicion. The orb had not yet acted in a way the band could fully understand. No offering had been asked, no command had been given. It had watched, touched, and perhaps, for reasons inscrutable,
intervened a hair's breadth toward healing. Whether out of compassion, curiosity, or some long-term program beyond human comprehension, the presence had altered the immediate trajectory of suffering. As the sunlight moved higher, the orb shifted position and began to rise. It did not disappear abruptly. It lifted with an economy that suggested a completion of sorts. When it finally vanished beyond the rim of the trees, leaving the band to the quiet, something inside them had sped up and slowed at once. The sick did not become well instantly. Cora's cough still rattled, but the intensity of the fever flattened a bit. The robber's edge had been dulled. Actions followed, more careful tending, a stricter rotation of caregivers, a new sound in the caretaker's hum that steadied like a metronome.
The presence had not bestowed a miracle. It had nudged a system that was poised between collapse and adaptation. Questions settled over the band like a new dew. Who were these visitors? Why were they here? Had they come to test, to help, or to harvest knowledge and leave? Or was their appearance simply a different kind of weather, a passing phenomenon whose appearance would mean nothing in the long run? The band had no tools to measure motive, only experience and the feelings lodged in their bones. They argued, not loudly, but in the small, dogged voices of people who must make decisions before there are answers. Some wanted to follow the orb's path, to track its arc across the sky and plead for further intervention. Others counseled prudence, to keep tending their own and not to chase a light that may be indifferent. Cora, in those hours, felt something shifted in her inner compass. Where she had once reacted with a small affiliative selfishness, protect the young, feed the old, she now found herself reaching, in small gestures, beyond the tight circle she had kept. She began to teach a child how to hold a bowl steadier, and when her hand touched the child did not recoil, but made a new sound, one that seemed to invite and to bind. It was as if the filament had threaded a practice into them, a micro-habit of recognition. When night fell again, the band gathered with a different arrangement around the fire. No one outshouted the other. No one led a chorus of worship. Instead, people sat and made the small moves that had always mattered, patching clothes, passing water, sharing the dull work of mending. The orb's visitation had not changed the basic economics of their lives. It had, however, introduced a variable. Within that variable, threads could be tugged. The band was newly aware that preservation of a single life might reshape patterns for generations. Outside, the dark stretched its spine and the stars saturated the sky with indifferent light. The band's worries were not resolved. The decision whether to hold close or to distance remained a live issue. Somewhere beyond the hill, other bands slept unbothered, oblivious to the exchange that had taken place in this small pocket of grass and smoke. The night pressed on with its usual difficulty. Cora's breath came in fits that night. She felt the cooling of fever, then the return of heat. Memory flashed, the river, the drop in the ocean, the sense of being both separate and part of a great fabric, and then the image evaporated, not replaced but hinted at. The filament had not given her a doctrine. It had given her a sliver of experience, like a key that only works for a particular lock. If she had to name it, it would be something between recognition and injunction. Remember to remember. The band slept fitfully. Some tossed and turned and dreamed of children running with antlers on their heads. Others heard the hum of the elders' new cadence and dreamed of healing.
The sick breathed and coughed and sometimes turned pale under the starlight. The orb had gone, but its absence left a residual field, an awareness that the band's small world might be part of something larger. That awareness could become memory, and memory, in time, can become practice. And yet, even as possibility flowered, friction appeared in small, old ways. The hunter who had bristled at proximity resumed his distance a bit too strictly one morning, and a simmering resentment festered in the small domestic economies of food and attention. Fear is a stubborn weed. It does not yield to a single visitation. The band, in its human complexity, remained both generous and cautious, open and jealous. The filament's visit had introduced an option, not a law. It had nudged them toward care, but not replaced the choices that build communities: trust, reciprocity, and the ever-necessary commitment to show up on behalf of another. As dawn lit the sky a pale, thin blue, Cora turned her face toward the place where the orb had risen. Her lungs still betrayed her in small ways, but her attention had shifted, collapsed outward, and then returned. She felt small gratitudes. People had stayed, someone had smoothed her hair, that knit into a desire to reciprocate. In the low pit of her chest there was now a tiny ember of something that was not only personal survival, but the sense of being required, a duty to keep a thread alive because the fabric needed it. The world had not become revelation. It remained messy and partial, but the visit had planted an image of continuity that the band had not possessed before, an image that could, over generations, alter how they counted who mattered. If a single life might be saved not for its own sake only, but because it held value as a thread in the loom of being, then perhaps choices would be made with a new horizon in mind. At the edge of the clearing, a soft sound emerged, a faint rustle that was not wind. It was the echo of movement, a pattern repeating. Cora peered into the dim and saw something at the boundary of vision, a shimmer like heat over rock. It could have been nothing. It could have been a field of optical play. But as she squinted, the shimmer resolved into a small, slow descent of light, subtle, deliberate. The band froze again, the old rhythms of worry unspooling into a new readiness. No one spoke. The filament had been gone, but the sky's answer was returning, which meant decisions would have to be revisited. Cora felt the thread of continuity tighten, and with it a question like a stone in her mouth. What would happen if they accepted further intervention? Would it remake them into beings who depended on outside rescue? Or would it teach them ways to remember the larger field so they might act differently on their own terms? The light descended, and in that descent, the story tightened to a single hinge. The filament flickered like a moth testing glass.
The band's breath hovered, carved from the old fear and the new hope. If the visitors came back, would they be healers, auditors, teachers, or simply observers who could not be reduced to human categories? And if a single life was to be preserved for reasons the band could not yet see, would the cost be only gratitude, or would it demand changes in how life was lived and loved? Cora reached for the hand of the woman who had stayed at her side. Their fingers found one another in the low light, a small clasp that felt suddenly weightier than it had before. Outside, the descending light completed its final few steps, coming to rest with the hush of ocean surf against shore. The band leaned forward. The future, as it always had, was a motion that required only one step to alter direction. In that moment, as the filament's tip hovered above the trampled grass and the sixth breath drew a new pattern, Cora felt a thought, not fully formed, not yet a conviction, pass through her like a cold draft. If there is a field in which consciousness moves and preserves itself, then perhaps saving a single thread is an act that ripples into unknown generations. Maybe, she thought with the patient confusion of fever and awe, saving one life might be a way of remembering what was always secreted inside living things, that they are less alone than they suppose. The light reached toward them again, precise and nonviolent. The band's small human argument paused, its sharp edges smoothed by something that was neither sermon nor law. The filament touched the air near Cora's temple, and the world tilted under the weight of a question that would not be answered in the short arc of this night. The filament touched the air near Cora's temple, and the world tilted under the weight of a question that would not be answered in the short arc of this night. The contact was not hot or piercing, but like the cool fingertip of water laid against a fevered forehead. For an instant, Cora's skin registered a map of small lights moving beneath it, points of color that glanced off one another and then braided into a slow, intelligible weave. She saw, in a manner that felt less like seeing and more like coming into the same room with an old friend, the interior of her chest reconfigured, the cough's raggedness smoothed at the edges, the clotted heat that had been a knot of sensation unraveled into a thread she could follow with a finger of attention. Around her, the band watched without the usual panic. Time condensed and extended at once. Minutes stretched like wet taffy. The filament made no sound, but a low harmonic threaded the air, a resonance that seemed to tune each listener's breathing to the same meter. Cora felt that resonance travel along her spine into the hollow of her sternum and then scatter in tiny luminous motes that touched muscle, lining, and breath.
The sensation was clinical in its effectiveness and ineffable in its meaning. Something was being altered with the precision of a surgeon and the tact of a lover. From the orb, a luminous web unfurled beneath the surface of things. It did not invade, it overlaid. Where it passed, the microscopic violence of the infection was, for reasons the band could not name, made visible. Little clusters of shadow that had lodged like soot along the breath stream broke apart into glittering dust and were pulled away along unseen currents. Cora felt this evacuation as a lightness at the heart of her chest, a recalibration of pressure that let her inhale past the broken edges of panic. If the band had had words for microbes and immune response, they would have said the being and fished something out of her. Lacking those words, they described what they felt in other registers. It unknotted her, said the elder under his breath. It took the thorn, murmured the healer. A child giggled as if tickled by a passing breeze, small testaments to the new physics at work. But alongside the biotechnical work, another exchange was taking place, one that the band felt as a rearrangement of inward landscape. Cora's boundaries thinned. Where previously breath and body had been tidy divisions, she now perceived edges as foamy and porous, like foam on a shore. She felt in quick tidal images the living continuity of things. The river she had remembered earlier returned, now full of faces she almost recognized, children she would never meet, hands she could not name, a future voice calling a syllable that was not yet spoken. She felt an extension outward, a thread tying her to birds and sleeping roots, and a woman in a clay shelter many generations hence who would hum the same note the elder had hummed tonight. These impressions arrived not as doctrine, but as sensory blinks, a conch whose inside held maps, a tide that folded itself into a pattern and then opened, an experiential nudge toward a way of seeing. In that nudge there was neither coercion nor command. If the filament had a vocabulary, it spoke in the grammar of touch and the metaphor of seam, to repair, to join, to preserve the continuity of a living line. At one point, amid the flux of image and adjustment, a voice, if it could be called that, entered the field. It was not heard in the ear, but resonated inside the place where memory and sensation braided. Brief, crystalline syllable surfaced. We keep, they will weave. Remember. The voice carried the tilt of an explanation, but without the arrogance of certainty. It suggested a motive in simple terms, an attentional program that tended to emerging systems. It did not preach. It did not name itself as God or judge. It framed itself like a librarian who is reluctant to let a single manuscript burn. Cora could not have parsed the grammar, but she felt the meaning the way one feels a hand find a lost object in the dark.
The filament's light coaxed a pattern into common sight, a web of positions and times where small discontinuities in living attention could collapse an entire future. That image, so spare, so spatial, was the alien's language for why it acted. Preserve a thread here, and the loom may yet bear a pattern in which many lives are possible. The band's practical world responded. The healer counted beats and measured pulse in the only ways available, fingers against throat, the tilt of lips, the sweat-damp hair. A small fall in fever registered like an arithmetic of relief. The hunter's breathing eased. His brow, which had been carved into lines of pain, softened. It was not a cure in the mythic sense. There were still bruises and systemic wear. Organs had been taxed and had to rebuild. But the acute catastrophe had been arrested. The trajectory that had been sliding toward collapse now found a ridge to rest against. When the alien's filament withdrew, it left a residue not of technology, but of practice. The elderly woman who had hummed found her voice now carrying a steadying cadence that steadied others. The child who had been skittish moved closer without the recoil he had shown the night before. The hunter who had pushed distance softened in his exchanges. These were small shifts in habit, new microstabilities that would, if repeated, accumulate like sediment into culture. The filament had not imposed them, it had sedimented them into the band's environment as possibilities to be chosen. The alien's presence extended only as far as necessary. After working at the micro level, it retracted from the scene and hovered above, a patient geometry against the morning. For a long moment it remained simply there, a luminous presence holding an ambiguous posture. The head of the band watched it with the same calculating patience he employed when weighing food or safety. He did not kneel, he did not offer gifts. He stood with the sober dignity of one who owns the responsibility of stewardship.
When the aliens' communication resumed, it spoke in those spare, luminous images again. No long speeches, no sermonizing. The impressions were like a map in negative space. Preserve emergent minds, it implied, and you preserve the play of consciousness. We watch for threads near loss. We will not bind you to us. We will not claim dominion. You are brief and valuable. Sometimes we act. That was the whole of the explanation, a claim of custodial attention and a renunciation of empire. There was a humility in it that compounded rather than eased the band's perplexity. Why had it chosen Cora? Why that particular string in a vast pattern? The aliens' images suggested no moral calculus that humans could translate. Instead, they offered an operational fact, thresholds where the loss of a single instance would disproportionately alter a developing complexity. For whatever algorithm of choice or compassion it employed, Cora had been on the cusp.
The band did not have a word for gratitude in the contemplative sense the alien might have hoped for. They had acts: to stay, to share meat, to feed, to hold. They enacted a reciprocity that was immediate and apt. They arranged their days around tending. They kept watch in rotations that were more careful now, less punctuated by ad hoc fear. The elder initiated a small practice. At the first light of each morning, they would spend 3 breaths together, an intake, a held moment, an exhale, before they set about their day. It was not a ritual of domination, but a check, a communal breathing that functioned like a hinge. It served, for them, as a memory signal that something had intruded into their usual world and offered a possibility worth honoring. Not all reactions were so gracefully accepted. Some in the band returned to suspicion. The same instinct that preserved them, caution toward strangers, reasserted itself. A man who had lost kin in another sickness muttered that gifts have hooks. An older caregiver feared dependence. If they learned to expect outside rescue, would their survival skills atrophy? These were reasonable concerns. The Filament's visit had not erased the arithmetic that had shaped their lives for generations. Humans do not change in a season. Over the ensuing weeks, Cora convalesced slowly. Her cough became less of a storm and more of a remembered splinter. She slept often and dreamed wildly, dreams full of rivers that spoke in echoes, of hands passing on a strange, humming knowledge, of children born later who carried a cadence in their throat that matched the elders'. In waking hours, she practiced small changes. When she handed a bowl, she set it down with a hand over the rim, catching the recipient's gaze in a new way. Her laugh acquired a pause before it spilled out, a moment that felt like a listening. She taught a child how to steady a water skin between knees. The child learned the hold and added a small sound that steadied others. These small practices were the aliens' gifts, if gifts they were, implanted not as content but as capacity. Months passed with the slow architecture of habit. The band reorganized care rotations with less ferocity and more deliberation. When one of them fell ill, the group's response was steadier. Their bodies did not become immune to disease, nor did their lives become effortless. Yet a small cultural shift took root. They made small pauses before action. They named the presence of others with a look that said, "I notice you." They began to mark survival with a practical sign, a notch on a communal bone, a set of pebbles realigned at the camp entrance. Over time, these marks might be read as memory, and memory has the habit of architecture. A change in how people act, repeated, becomes a structure. There were also stories, as there always are. The Filament's visit's appropriation into narrative took many forms. Some told of light that healed, others warned of threads it might be pulled taut. Stories arc in the direction of utility and warning. They simplified the complex event into teachable lines. In later nights, around the same fire, children asked for an account and received a dozen versions spun by those who had been present, exaggerations for color, sobering frames for caution. That multiplicity of telling is itself a form of cultural processing. Events do not exist divorced from their retelling. The alien, for its part, did not return often. It had shown what it had to show and moved back into a patient distance. The band could have tried to follow the orb's path, to chase after the architecture of rescue, but the sky is a vast and indifferent map, and the orb did not appear for petition so much as observation and occasional nudge. To follow it would have risked dissolving the band's own agency into a pursuit of external answers. They did not do that. Instead, some among them treated the visit as a caution and a charge. Tend, but do not outsource the tending. Remember, but do not make memory into liturgy that eclipses action. The long view of consequence is always slippery. We can imagine, as a thought experiment, subtle ripples. the elder's morning breathing cadence passing into a nettled set of customs, the child's steadying sound spreading across nearby groups when foraging overlapped, a way of teaching younger members to notice the breath and the small distortions that precede collapse. Perhaps those changes reverberated like low harmonics, influencing patterns of care that increased the likelihood of survival in a wash of statistical smallness. Or perhaps the changes dissolved when other stresses, drought, predation, clan conflict, exerted their stronger pressures. The story resists tidy endings, which is the point. Possibility and contingency exist together. Years later, when Cora was older and her hands marked with new maps of work, she would sometimes stand at the edge of the clearing and find the place where the orb had once grounded. Children would gather at her feet, and one day she would place her palm over the child's small chest and smoothed the air there with the practiced economy of someone who had been taught a way of holding. The child never quite knew whether that gesture was a blessing, a habit, or simply practical guidance. Still, the action stuck. In the hum of the camp, another voice, the elder's cadence, wove into Cora's small new rhythm. Out of accident and intervention and necessity, practices had been planted. If this were a myth written centuries later, institutions might have polished it into doctrine, and priests might have kept the memory crisp and proprietary. The historical pattern is, however, more delicate and dangerous. Memory erodes under practical pressure. What is useful is kept. What is strange is sometimes quarantined. And where the social cost of remembering is high, people forget or embed truth into neutral forms.
The band, already constrained by day-to-day survival, had neither inclination nor power to fossilize the event for distant generations. The filament's visit lived on in acts more than in dogma, an extra rotation of care, a particular way of holding a child, a humming cadence that steadied tears and breath alike. Which brings us forward, not in years but in idea, to how such an event resonates in our present thought. This is, and must be reiterated as we approach interpretation, a speculative scenario. It is a what-if, an exercise in imagination that blends what we know about biology and social life with an ethical and metaphysical question about the continuity of consciousness. It does not claim factuality for history. The point is not to prove that an orb once healed a throat on a high plane. It is to explore the meaning and consequences if such preservation were possible. If you imagine an intelligence that monitored emergent systems for thresholds where a single loss could bloom into a cascade, the ethical questions are immediate and heavy. Who decides which threads to preserve? Does an external savior create dependence, or does it provide a critical nudge that allows a nascent system to develop resilience? What responsibility is attached to the act of touching another life, an obligation that ripples across generations and across the biographical arc of whole species? These questions do not yield to quick answers, and that is intentional. The thought experiment is meant to hold their weight. One ethical seam seems especially important, the difference between preservation and control. The alien in the story operated as an observer who intervened sparingly. Its motive was continuity, not dominion. That distinction is critical. Preservation honors the possibility of autonomous development. Control imposes a path. If one values the play of emergence, the openness of futures, then interventions that act to preserve must be judged by humility and by a refusal to rewrite a system's narrative in full. There is also the social dimension of forgetting and suppression. Human institutions, of knowledge, religion, and power, have historically filtered and refracted odd events into forms that meet their needs. Sometimes that filtration preserves knowledge, sometimes it obscures uncomfortable truths or rebrands them for the maintenance of structure. In our speculative scenario, the band does not have the apparatus to institutionalize the visit. In larger societies, similar events could be alternately canonized, buried, or commodified. The recurring pattern is not a conspiracy, but a human tendency. When a story threatens an existing economic or social calculation, it is either harnessed or discarded. Recognizing that pattern is part of cultivating humility around extraordinary claims. Yet the most practical, least doctrinal takeaway is about practice.
The alien's gift in the story was not doctrine, but capacities, a sliver of attunement to the whole, and a few habits that anchored attention. If we translate that into contemporary life, without claiming metaphysical authority, we land on three simple secular practices that map well onto the band's emergent behaviors and that anyone can try as a way to cultivate presence and ethical responsibility. Try these as experiments rather than prescriptions. Pause. Build a small breathing hinge into your day. 3 slow breaths before beginning a task. The intake, the held moment, the gentle release, functions like the band's morning breathing. It is a way to reorient attention from habitual reaction to conscious choice. Start with 1 set in the morning, and if useful, 1 before meals or decisions. Recognition. Practice noticing someone else with the minimal effort of eye contact and affirmation. It can be as small as catching another's gaze and silently naming them in the mind. I see you. In the story, that gesture recalibrated care. In our lives, it can soften the hard edges of passing indifference. Gratitude is a practice of reciprocity. Offer a simple, specific thanks. Not a grand declaration, but a pointed recognition of what another has done. Say it aloud if appropriate, or touch the other person's hand lightly. These micro-actions help encode a social economy of care, rather than leaving kindness to ad hoc happenstance. None of these practices promises a metaphysical guarantee. They are small tools, micro-rituals, that, if repeated, shift patterns. They are our speculative equivalents of the elder's hum and Cora's steadying touch. Returning to the story's final image, think of Cora's hand reaching out in a newly deliberate way to a child whose small fingers close around hers. The gesture is modest, physical, and unspectacular. It does not dissolve into myth. It is the literal passing of a capacity, the micro-habit that may, across a fog of contingency, ripple outward. That is the ethical locus. Small acts that, multiplied, create different fields of possibility. If the alien visit had been recorded in stone or sung into a canon, it would be easy to interpret and to weaponize. Instead, it left a set of practices and a question open in the air. Who, if anyone, should steward such knowledge? What does it mean to preserve a thread with respect for the autonomy of the web? There are no tidy answers, only the ongoing work of attention. So consider this scene, this small band under a sky touched by another attention, as an invitation. Imagine the possible shapes of responsibility that attend the saving of a single life. Ask yourself, what obligations attach to the preservation of consciousness? Do we as a species have duties to each other's fragile threads that go beyond immediate kinship? How do we balance intervention with freedom? If this thought experiment moves you, try the small practice now. Pause and take 3 slow breaths.
Then, for 30 seconds, notice who is in the room with you. If you are alone, include the presence of the houseplant, the hum of a distant car, the small awareness of breath itself. Silently offer a brief recognition. I see you. Finally, name 1 small thing you are grateful for, and if possible, express it aloud or share it with someone. If this story touched something in you, share your experience below. What did you notice during those breaths? Did a memory come up? A question? A hesitation? Your reflections help shape how we wrestle with ideas that resist neat conclusions. This is a speculative story set in the key of wonder and responsibility. It does not claim the past as proof, nor does it propose an easy moral. It offers instead a scene, a life saved and altered, a visitor who acted with restraint, a band that adopted practical habits that might, in small ways, change futures. The saving of 1 thread left the loom with a slightly different pattern. Whether that pattern expanded or frayed is the enduring, unanswered call of imagination. If you'd like to explore more thought experiments that sit at the edge of science, myth, and ethics, consider subscribing. For now, pause with the question the story leaves at its center. Who is conscious right now? Share what you find.